Hey everybody, it's Michael Arria. I'm the U.S. correspondent at Mondoweiss, and I'm usually joined here at the Shift Podcast by my colleague Adam Horowitz, but he's off this week, so it's just me. And I decided to jump on here solo because there's some notable news. Obviously, there has been some notable news over the last few days. Actually, quite a bit of news, but we're actually only going to talk about one thing here. And before I get to it, I wanted to quickly point out that you can subscribe to the Shift podcast, the video podcast on our YouTube channel, which I would encourage you to do, and also like it because that helps out. But you could also get the Shift newsletter, which is packed with even more information about US politics and how it relates to these issues. And you can get that on our website. You can subscribe to it and get it in your inbox every Thursday. And while you're there, if you're not already subscribed, you can also subscribe to our Power and Pushback newsletter, which comes out every other Tuesday and documents activism within the US and attempts to suppress it, the Trump administration's crackdown on pro-Palestine movement and connected activism and movements. So I would encourage everybody to do that. And thank you for reading. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. You can also donate to our site at our site, as we are sustained by readers like yourself and, don't get money from billionaires or big corporations or advertisers. So with that all said, I wanted to talk about the passing of Lindsey Graham, who died this weekend at the age of 71, just a child in Senate years. And I think that Graham really leaves a definitive legacy. I mean, it's easy to forget this, but it wasn't that long ago, particularly when the Tea Party movement first started, during the Obama era, where Graham was viewed by many, including the mainstream media, I think, as something of a moderate Republican. If you recall, he had, reached across the aisle to work on things like immigration reform, healthcare. I believe he voted in favor of two of the democratically selected, or two Obama picks for the Supreme Court. Or one Obama pick and one Biden pick, excuse me. Graham, the thing that really, and I should point out that, like many Republicans, he publicly was critical of Donald Trump's ultimate successful presidential run in 2016. He had this tweet that people were quoting a lot the day he died, that if the Republican Party nominated Donald Trump in 2016, he'd destroy the party or something to that effect. And the reality is, once Trump came in power, he didn't really have a closer ally than Graham, who was kind of supported him in everything that he did. Trump revealed that he also had a brief criticism after the January 6th insurrection, but had basically called the president and apologized to him, shortly after he had said it. So he ended up being kind of a lackey for Donald Trump. But he also, the striking thing about Lindsey Graham and his legacy is this is just, one of the most hawkish Congress members in the history of the body in many ways. I mean, this guy was in Congress for almost 30 years, right? Because he was a South Carolina rep before he became a senator almost 25 years ago. And, you just run through the gamut of military conflict during his era, enthusiastic supporter of the war in Afghanistan, enthusiastic supporter of the war in Iraq, a real Russia hawk, despite the fact that, you've in recent years, you've seen many people in his party move away from that, come to question the U.S. relationship with Ukraine more and more. That was not Lindsey Graham, who, had rallied against the START treaty, who had called at one point, I believe, for Putin to be assassinated. He, enthusiastic supporter of sending more and more weapons to Ukraine, called at one point for more U.S. troops to be put in Niger, which, by the way, the U.S. has troops in Niger. Fun fact. And Lindsey Graham was calling for more to be added, called for regime change in Libya, supported the NATO intervention, supported the NATO intervention in Libya, called for regime change in Syria, called for, regime change invasions in recent months, in retrospect, at the end of his life, in places in Latin America like Venezuela and Cuba. So the Cuban government's days were numbered. Only recently, in retrospect, weeks before his death. So this was a guy who was just a straight up hawk. If you took a globe and spun it with your eyes closed and, stopped it on a country, chances are that Lindsey Graham has advocated for invading that country. And principal among these foreign policy causes was Israel, one of the Senate's most enthusiastic backers of Israel, and had been pushing, as we'll get to in a second, I think, had been pushing a war on Iran for years, for decades, really, much like Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been pushing for a war. But I wanted to just quickly go through some notable quotes from Lindsey Graham amid the genocide, in case anybody forgot some things that he said. So these are some quotes, relatively recent quotes, all I think from the last few years, about from Lindsey Graham regarding Israel and Gaza. So he said, Palestinians in Gaza are the most radicalized population on the planet who are taught to hate Jews from birth. It will take years to fix this problem. When I hear from the river to the sea, it reminds me of the final solution. The Hamas terrorists are the SS on steroids. I'm tired of the word genocide. If Israel desired to commit genocide, they possess the means to, but choose not to. Give Israel what they need to fight the war they can't afford to lose. This is Hiroshima and Nagasaki on steroids. Lindsey Graham, multiple times alluded to the fact that said the Gaza should be flattened, also alluded to the fact that or implied that it also should also be hit with a nuclear bomb. He asked NBC News in 2024, why is it okay for America to drop 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end their existential threat? Why was it okay for us to do that? I thought it was okay. So Israel, do whatever you want to do. Do whatever you have to do to survive as a Jewish state. So that's Lindsey Graham's position on genocide. He's for it. And I just one more quote here, which I think is very notable. This court, he's referring now to the ICC, is for Africa in thugs like Putin. It is not for democracies like Israel and the United States. So, the ICC is created in Lindsey Graham's vision, or in Lindsey Graham's opinion, the ICC was created for African countries. I should point out that I'm recording this yesterday. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced or vowed to dismantle the International Criminal Court, which the Trump administration has essentially waged a war on behalf of Israel for quite some time. But I digress. Back to Lindsey Graham. The interesting thing about Lindsey Graham, I think when we look back on this era, is that, like I said, he pushed for this war in Iran for many decades, as did Netanyahu. And he became, in many ways, I think if you look at the reporting on Trump's ultimate decision to start the war in February, he became kind of a notable go-between. And I thought there was a really good piece that I would encourage everybody to take a look at in Haaretz. This was actually it might have been 2 days ago. I think it was July 12th. Ben Samuels writing in Haaretz, talking about how Graham's death was a blow to Israel, as they no longer have a, quote, clear voice in Trump's ear. I'm going to quote Samuels here. He says, Graham, like no other U.S. lawmaker or advisor, consistently had Trump's full attention on matters relating to foreign policy. He served as both a private middleman between Trump and Netanyahu, but also as a megaphone for pushing Netanyahu's party line in public forums. And this is the interesting part right here. It was true during Trump's first term, but even more so during his current stint in the White House. Graham's hits on Fox News and his posts on X concerning Israel and the Middle East were often messages effectively lifted from Netanyahu's mind and aimed at an audience of one. So, as Samuel states, Lindsey Graham was taking these ideas of, bombing, regime change, crackdown on Iran's nuclear program from Netanyahu, the same stuff that Netanyahu's been pushing for years on U.S. administrations and the U.S. Congress, and bringing them directly to Trump. And as Samuels points out, we know that how Trump, it's been reported many times, how he processes media and how he makes decisions and how he looks at stuff. So he was really making those, pleas on behalf of Israel for this. And now we fast forward to the actual war, which, this guy lives just long enough to see his dream finally realized, this attack on Iran. But he also lives long enough to see the U.S. lose yet another war. I don't think, we've talked about this on prior Shift podcasts. Maybe we talked about it in the last one. Leaving aside the moral component of, bombing a country for no reason and killing, hundreds of civilians. Additionally, just going by the stated goals of the US and Israel going into this war, they achieved none of them. So if you go down the list, regime change, a drastic reform to the Iranian nuclear program, opening up the strait, whatever it is, none of it was achieved by Trump. Absolutely none of it. And the United States now has lost yet another war. And the current administration cannot explain or justify why the US was there. And, I think that this will, it goes without saying, it's going to have a drastic impact, I think, on the midterms. In fact, you're already seeing Trump. There's supposed to be this big announcement. I don't know, maybe it's happened since I've started recording, but there's supposed to be this big announcement about Trump with supposed proof that 2020 election there was fraud in the 2020 election. It was rigged, which I guess, I don't know what the argument is going to be, that Hugo Chavez's ghost rigged it or something. And the idea here is that, obviously throwing water on the forthcoming elections, which is shaping up to perhaps be a bloodbath for the Republicans, despite the Democrats having a variety of their own problems. I think it goes without saying that obviously, the worldwide economy, the price of gas, the optics of the situation. I mean, you just look at the polling in terms of support for the war, and you look at the polling in terms of support for Israel, which is completely eroded. And we're in a much different time because of this when it comes to the perception of these things among the U.S. population, and the war. Lindsey Graham's fingerprints are all over this war, but his push also helps result, I think, in a plummeting of Israel's standing within the world, particularly among the U.S. population, U.S. voters. And there was an interesting piece in the New York Times, actually, also 2 days ago, called "Lindsey Graham Championed Israel Even as Wars Eroded American Support." And it talks about how the U.S. population has turned on Israel. It talks about how the most effusive praise when Graham passed away came from Israeli leaders, right? I mean, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, this is him, he said, "Israel has lost one of its greatest friends. America has lost a great patriot." Israeli President Isaac Herzog, speaking after Graham's death, said, "Senator Graham was a beacon of moral clarity and a true leader of the U.S.-Israel partnership. We will never forget how he stood by the people of Israel in our most difficult moments, and we will remain eternally grateful for his sense of justice, truth, and loyalty." So this New York Times piece goes through how he's being praised by Israeli leaders, and he, was an extreme hawk when it comes to Israel, but how it happened kind of amid a public opinion shift on the issue. And quoting now from the piece, they write, "The war exacerbated a sea change in public opinion in the United States, eroding long-held bipartisan support for the Israeli government." I disagree with that assertion. Obviously, I think the sea change on Israel began long before February. I mean, we've been reporting on it at Mondoweiss for years, but it goes without saying that the Iran war did Israel no favors when it came to that public opinion. I think in many ways it's pushed it over the edge and made it, given it kind of an irreparable problems. I don't really see it coming back after this, especially when you look at the polling among Republicans, the only political group in the country that still has majority support for Israel. And you look at that support when you break it down by age group, young Republicans have turned on Israel in large numbers, and I think they'll continue to. And the party will have to grapple with that going forward. This is Herzog again, the president of Israel. "Israel's image is worsening in the United States across the board among Republicans as well as Democrats. But Lindsey remained very firm in his support. one of the most prominent voices for the U.S.-Israel alliance. So, I think that comment really says it all, because I'm sorry, that actually, I said that was Herzog, but it wasn't President Herzog. It was Mike Herzog, who served as an Israel ambassador to Washington during the Biden presidency. But I wasn't quoting it because of who said it. I was quoting it because of the sentiment there, which Lindsey remained very firm in his support, as Herzog says, despite the fact that the Israel's image, like you said, is worsening and worsening. So I think that when we look back on Lindsey Graham, he will be remembered during this time as one of the most prominent hawks, a guy who came out of the war on terror and never kind of shifted his position. I think the U.S. population during that time was very supportive of these kind of endless wars in the Middle East after September 11th, and the numbers indicate that they have flipped on that issue. You can just look at the polling for something like the war in Iran compared to the war in Iraq. But Lindsey Graham did not shift in any way, remained a steadfast hawk to the end. And I think will continue to live in the world that he helped create. And like I said, he lived long enough to see his dream in terms of a war in Iran realized, but he also lived to see support for Israel begin to erode, and lived long enough to see the U.S. lose that war against Iran. So I think he's a major figure, and I would encourage people to check out our site and maybe just put Lindsey Graham into our search bar, because we published dozens of pieces about his support for Israel and his impact on the U.S. political system, which is not small at all. I think it's pretty sizable. And so that's all for today. I just wanted to hop on a little abbreviated version of the Shift podcast this week without Adam, but I wanted to hop on and share those thoughts and just remind everybody that Lindsey Graham was a pro-war and pro-genocide, and now he's dead. So thanks again for listening to the Shift podcast, and thank you for subscribing to the newsletters, reading us at the site. And I continue to subscribe. Please, if you don't already subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe to those newsletters, and check out the site for more information. We're covering a lot of things this week, obviously. In addition to Lindsey Graham, we have the situation in the West Bank with Ro Khanna, and as I said, the Rubio quoted effort to dismantle the ICC. There's a new Mahmoud Khalil lawsuit launched today against the federal government, and today we just published actually a newsletter, Power and Pushback, about the Prairie Land defendants, the verdicts in the Prairie Land case, and how it potentially will impact the wider left and pro-Palestine activism. A great interview with an attorney at Palestine Legal. So check that all out. And thanks again for watching and subscribing, and have a good day.